biggest pirate treasure of all time is within our grasp.
You have something I want.
I need you on this one.
It's been a while. Too long, boy.
I originally reviewed A Thief's End when it launched in 2016, and while my opinions on it haven't changed, I feel like there's so much more I want to say about it. Even 4 years later, I haven't played anything since that left such a lasting impression. I wanted to revisit the sandy shores and dense jungles of Uncharted 4 almost immediately after I first played it, mostly because I enjoyed it so much, but also to see if I could better understand exactly what makes it so compelling, and in my opinion the best in the series. It's still one of the most technically impressive games on the PlayStation 4, but Uncharted 4 is so much more than gorgeous visuals, and in a way they kind of do it a disservice because they overshadow the brilliance of its design elsewhere. One of its greatest achievements is the use of allegory. Where the earlier entries have relatively one-dimensional plots, A Thief's End has two main storylines that cleverly overlap and speak to a broader theme. Like all of the other mainline entries, the events follow Nathan Drake as he once again travels the world in search of long-lost treasure. Unlike the other entries though, this is a character-driven story, and Nate is searching for more than simply fortune this time. Okay, so before I go on any further, I'm going to try and keep this video as spoiler-free as possible, but for reasons which those of you who've already played it will understand, that is very, very difficult to do with this game. As a result, this review is not entirely spoiler-free. I haven't blown the ending or anything major like that, but it would be impossible to talk at length about the gameplay, story and themes and not give something away. So while I've been careful not to reveal anything, there are some minor spoilers just through some of the gameplay that I've used. Unfortunately, just about every video review I've seen spoils at least one, if not more of the many surprises. Man, even the official trailer ruins a couple of the best moments. If by some miracle you haven't seen anything, then I beg you, please skip to the part where I talk about which platform to play it on and give you my final thoughts.
Sic parvis magna.
Sic parvis magna.
Sic parvis magna is a Latin phrase which translates as "thus great things from small things" or "greatness from small beginnings." It's the motto of Sir Francis Drake, the famous English explorer, and according to the Uncharted games, ancestor to series protagonist Nathan Drake. This motto acts as a kind of driving force for Nate, and it plays a particularly important role in this story. Nate is portrayed as a likeable everyman, and a bit of an underdog much like his famous ancestor. Throughout the series we follow Nate's adventures to exotic locations, unravel fantastic mysteries, and even get caught up in a little hanky-panky. In the original trilogy, we only get to see one side of Nate's life, the exciting, adventurous, romantic side. But in Uncharted 4, we see what his life is like at home, what his relationships look like, how he manages a somewhat regular job, and how he struggles with the mundaneness of a normal existence. In a chapter literally titled A Normal Life, we meet a retired version of Nate. He's given up his globe-trotting ways and settled down with Elena. The life he used to live, and the one we've experienced in his previous adventures, is little more than memories captured in photos and dusty trinkets. So, why is watching him at home in his tracky pants important, you might ask? Well, Uncharted 4 is, and this is going to sound really corny, it's about finding oneself. And in order to understand Nate's struggle with this, we need to understand him on a more human level than we have before. By grounding his character in reality, it makes him more believable, and most importantly, more vulnerable. Having a stronger sense of Nate as a real person allows you to better connect with him and become invested in his cause. It's not simply a matter of finding the treasure and beating the bad guy this time. Nate is struggling to find happiness and purpose in his life. As a young man he sought fortune, but now he's not so sure the fortune he seeks is treasure. It's also a story about growing up, and not just for Nate, but for the studio and us the players that have grown up alongside him. It's about saying goodbye too. According to Naughtydog, this will be their last game to feature Nate, and it's obvious they wanted to bid him farewell in style. Of course, this isn't just a mushy tale about feelings, there's mystery, pirates, and puzzles too. Oh man, the puzzles. And it wouldn't be an Uncharted game without lost treasure. A Thief's End doesn't disappoint in this department either. El Dorado, Shambhala, and the City of the Pillars were cool and all, but come on, it's fucking pirates, man. As usual, the treasure is loosely based on historical events and folklore, and oddly the Goonies too. Drake is in search of the infamous pirate Henry Avery's legendary treasure. As you progress and gather clues, you discover more about Avery, and it becomes clear that he too wanted more than treasure, which incidentally is estimated to be worth a cool 400 million US, and that's about $1 billion dues for my Aussie viewers. There are many parallels throughout the game between Avery's tale and Nate's, not least of which is the fact that Sir Francis Drake, among many other titles, was himself a pirate. Even the game's title, A Thief's End, refers to both Nate's final adventure and the fate of one of the most notorious thieves in history. I think what makes the treasure in this game more interesting than the previous ones, other than it being about pirate treasure of course, is the legend that surrounds it and the many people who tried and failed to find it. You start off on what seems like a typical treasure hunt, but with each step that you get closer to finding it, a new detail emerges that makes you question what it is you're searching for. This is a formula that's repeated throughout the Uncharted games. You start in search of one thing, but then you find out that that thing is actually another thing, and then suddenly before you know it, there are interdimensional space zombies. This isn't new to the Uncharted games of course, actually it's a bit of a genre trope, which includes the many films that influenced this series. But here it's so perfectly executed and interlinks so seamlessly with the rest of the story, that by the time you get to the final chapter, you can't help but be blown away by it all.
What do you think about that, huh?
That's pretty cool.
The gameplay philosophy of the Uncharted series has always been about simplicity, and there's a couple of reasons for this. A key reason is because these games are trying hard not to be games, at least not in the traditional sense. This is why Naughtydog puts so much effort into removing, or at the very least reducing things like loading screens, UI, and other obvious video game elements. In order to keep you immersed and not break the fourth wall, the experience has to be seamless. This philosophy extends to the controls too. Nate might be a capable rock climbing, spelunking, puzzle solving fist fighter, but controlling him remains easy. The command list doesn't have complicated inputs or combinations, and many of Nate's abilities can be actioned with a single button press. Adding in a complex moveset or something like a skill tree might make the game more interesting for some, but it would certainly make it feel more like a video game. The recent God of War is a perfect example of this. There are many similarities between the recent God of War and Naughty Dog's games, but one of the biggest differences is that God of War has many detailed menus that you constantly need to open. These are necessary because of how much control the player is given over Kratos' abilities. The problem is that these menus literally pull you out of the world. Uncharted 4 doesn't allow you to modify Nate's abilities, or require that you open menus. His toolkit remains the same throughout, but mechanics are introduced as the game progresses to deal with new scenarios. But instead of these being added to a moves list or skill tree, you're given intuitive visual cues during gameplay to remind you of your options. So, for example, if you enter tall vegetation such as grass, Nate automatically crouches to become stealthy. You don't need to press a button to enter stealth mode, he just does it. Likewise, if you're hanging from a ledge, Nate will transition into a grabbing stance if you move towards an enemy, allowing you to pull them over the edge. In the instances where you need to read or inspect something closer, it's presented in-game, such as when you use the journal. The Uncharted games have always been designed to appeal to a broad audience, and accessibility, or newbie-friendly mechanics like these, are a necessity when creating games that can be enjoyed by everyone. That doesn't mean A Thief's End lacks depth in regards to gameplay, but it's not radically different from the earlier titles. It sticks to the series' three core pillars: combat, traversal, and puzzles. Where it improves on the previous entries is with the number of ways you can navigate each and how they overlap. Combat is more natural and dynamic, doing away with quick-time events and stiff scripted animations. Nate can still run, punch, jump, and shoot, but his improved mobility allows for more variety. Transitioning from something like a jump into a melee attack is just one of the many ways you have more options than before. Traversal has been completely overhauled. Nate will now reach for possible handholds, which means a lot of the platforming isn't as linear. There are still way too many sections where ledges are clearly highlighted with lighter markings if you ask me, and this is a side effect of making things more accessible, but it would have been nice if you could turn this off or adjust it. It doesn't hold your hand to the extent of an Ubisoft game, thankfully. If you want to find all the hidden treasures and extra dialogue sequences, you really have to search thoroughly. The stages are big too, so it's very easy to miss things, which provides an incentive to play through it again. I found that my second run was quite different from my first, and I'm sure there are still things I haven't seen. Platforming isn't the only thing that's less linear. The bigger levels have an almost sandbox feeling to them, which encourages exploration. You always end up in the same place, but there are many paths to get there. In some of the really big levels there are vehicles. These aren't just used to get around either. You can use them to access areas which would otherwise be out of reach, and they can even be used to solve environmental puzzles. There's a good mix of these head scratchers too, along with the bigger set piece puzzles. The bigger puzzles aren't nearly as hard as I'd like, although again this is probably a design choice to cater to the more casual audience. They do score points for creativity though. I still think Uncharted 2 has the best and most epic puzzles in the series, but the way the puzzles have been integrated into the plot is very well done and appreciated. I mentioned in my review of The Last of Us that pumping up the difficulty in the Uncharted series doesn't enhance the experience like it does in that game. Some people might enjoy the extra challenge, but when you dial up the difficulty, I find that stealth becomes a bit of a crutch. I'm sure with extensive knowledge of each level you could hypothetically play aggressively, but it doesn't make much sense to play that way. Staying unseen dramatically reduces the number of enemies you have to deal with, so going in guns blazing just makes it unnecessarily harder. If you're after an experience that's close to an Indiana Jones film, which mainly focuses on the story with some fun action in between, I'd recommend sticking with the moderate difficulty or lower. If you prefer your combat to be a bit slower paced, tactical, and maybe a little bit like Metal Gear, then by all means, jack it up. Without question, one of the most impressive things about Uncharted 4 is the presentation. From the crazy level of detail packed into each environment to the amazing reimagining of the classic theme. In 2016, it was easy to simply say the graphics are bullshit good and move on, but there's a reason it looks so pretty, and that goes well beyond the fact that you can see crow's feet on Nate's face. Naughtydog has proven to be quite handy with environmental storytelling, as demonstrated with The Last of Us, but Uncharted 4 is miles ahead of anything that came before it. The density of each area is incredible. Rooms are packed with objects, markets bustle with activity, and jungles teem with wildlife. This makes a lot of sense, as much of the game is about exploring every nook and cranny. My recent playthrough was just shy of 18 hours, and I'll bet that at least 3 or 4 of those were spent just wandering around taking it all in. Character facial animations have been motion captured for the first time in the series, and this makes the many cutscenes better for it. In fact, animations across the board have been massively improved, and characters move organically through each environment with a gracefulness I haven't seen in any other game. This is the first game in the mainline series that doesn't have Greg Edmonson helming the score, and that might sound alarming considering how iconic the original Uncharted theme is, but Henry Jackman's take on it is every bit as good. Jackman has been the main composer on plenty of movies including both Kick-Ass films, Kingsman's films, and the last 2 Captain America movies. He's also worked on a ton of others, most notably a couple of the Pirates of the Caribbean films with his mentor Hans Zimmer. Say what you will about the Pirates movies, but their scores definitely capture the spirit of adventure, and the same has been achieved here. I don't really know how to explain it, but it's Uncharted only more piratey, and that's most definitely a good thing. There isn't any part of this game that doesn't look gorgeous. Every inch of it has been considered, and as I mentioned earlier, it even cleverly hides loading screens. So apart from the initial load up, you're never presented with some kind of black screen, provided you don't die of course. There is so much this game does well, but it's not without problems. One of the things I don't like is how it handles the UI. Now it does have a UI, although it's very minimal and not persistent, at least on hard. It only appears when you equip a weapon or when enemies show up. This in particular is a perfect example of how something that wouldn't be noticed in other games stands out in a really polished game like Uncharted 4. So these UI elements aren't poorly designed, but they do spoil some of the suspense. By automatically appearing when enemies show up, they kind of announce, oh hey, the bad guys are here, you're about to enter an action sequence. And these hard transitions don't fit within the seamless design philosophy of the rest of the game. There are other elements that aren't amazing too. Many of these are Naughty Dog specific problems that are persistent in their other titles, such as your buddies being invisible to enemies. Apparently, this is a deliberate choice so that your companions don't give away your position. It does highlight a limitation with the AI though, in that they're unable to tell whether or not they will be seen when moving from cover to cover. According to various interviews with the developers, much of Uncharted 4 had to be built from scratch. This is because the PS4's architecture is very different from the PS3's, but there were undoubtedly some things they could bring across. This might explain some of these legacy issues, or they could be a sign that the AI is still limited by the PS4's hardware. But then there are design patterns, like the overused movable crates that aren't tied to code, which have been brought across too. These probably could have been left out or at least scaled back in their frequency. In other games, these sorts of problems might not be that big of a deal, or really problems at all, but unfortunately here they can be kind of distracting. You know when your parents say they're not angry with you, they're just disappointed? It's exactly the same here, only it's you who's disappointed. These problems take you out of the moment, they break that feeling of being truly engrossed in what's happening, and remind you that what you're playing is a simulation. I don't think any of them ruin the game, but they certainly prevent it from deserving a perfect score, if there is such a thing. When looking at the game from a performance standpoint, there's not really anything I can criticize. I'm not a developer, but from a layman's perspective it appears to run flawlessly. In other Naughty Dog games I have very occasionally encountered minor bugs and glitches, but not in Uncharted 4. Both the visual and audio presentation is rock solid. I did notice some minor drops in the frame rate in the large set piece moments, but never to the point where it was jarring. I did play through on the Pro though, which does provide a slight improvement in stability. So I guess this is the perfect time to segue into what's the best way to play it. Unlike Naughty Dog's previous PS4 title, The Last of Us Remastered, there isn't much in the way of enhancements for the Pro. Uncharted 4 is capped at 30 frames per second on both the base and Pro PS4s, unlike The Last of Us which had the option to run at 60. This is disappointing for sure, but I doubt it's because Naughty Dog didn't bother with a 60 frames per second option. It's most likely due to A Thief's End being such a big memory-sucking beast of a game that even the Pro couldn't handle running it at twice the frame rate. Okay, so what do you get playing on the Pro? By default, the base resolution is upped from 1080p to 1440p. It's not native 4K, but it is a significant bump in resolution. I run my Pro in downsampling mode because I play on a 1080p display, so the improvement playing like this is marginal. If you play on a 4K screen, then the higher resolution does make a noticeable difference. More noticeable than that though is it also runs in HDR, or High Dynamic Range Color, and this actually applies to both the base PS4 and the Pro, so if you have a HDR compatible screen you can use either machine to see this in action. I have a 4K HDR screen in my living room, and let me to tell you, there is a big difference between the 1080p display I normally game on and this one. It's a shame I can't show you this in a YouTube video, so you'll just have to take my word for it. Ultimately, the only real advantage of playing on the Pro is if you have a 4K screen. Other than that, there aren't really any other enhancements, and the experience across both machines is very similar.
I was a member of Captain Henry Avery's crew. You know who that is?
He was a pirate.
The pirate who pulled off the biggest heist in history and got away with it. I looked him up.
That's great.
Over $400 million worth of gold and jewels, all from one single ship. The Gunsway.
Yeah, I'm familiar with the story.
I think your enjoyment will really come down to what you want out of an Uncharted game. The first three were very much plot-driven, set-piece oriented affairs. And while you still get that, if you're mainly in it for the gameplay and you tend to zone out during the cutscenes, then yeah, this is likely to be your least favourite in the series. The focus on character development and the subsequent slower pace might feel like a step in the wrong direction for some, but I'd argue that story and characters have always been the foundation this series is built on. Uncharted 4 is like a love letter to the action-adventure genre, and specifically the films and games which this series draws inspiration from. There's a ton of Easter eggs and references to these throughout the game, and fans of this type of stuff will get a real kick out of it. It refines just about everything from the earlier games. It has one of the most beautiful and detailed game worlds of any game to date, and on top of this includes a well-crafted narrative with interesting characters that's unrivaled by the previous installments. That's why I believe this is such a solid entry and a fitting last chapter in Nate's story.